I'm going to talk about the new score. It's the HOPE score. It's the Hypothermia Outcome Prediction Score for patients in cardiac arrest, which will be treated by extracorporeal life support. And we're talking about another topic now. So it's basically deeply hypothermic patients, patients who are normally at a core temperature below 28 centigrade. So as you know, below 32 centigrades, but certainly below 30, and very likely below 28, people will go into cardiac arrest, either VF or asystole. And the question is, which patients should be rewarmed? Because right now, we are spending quite a lot of effort and resources on rewarming patients. And if you think that in some occasions there are even a few patients reaching the same hospital at the same time, there's really the question, who should be rewarmed because he has higher chances of survival. I just put also my colleague Mathieu Pasquier here on board, because he's basically the one who has basically pushed this score forward, and I'm just one of the co-authors. And this is Mathieu Pasquier, very bright, nice colleague, also in the International Commission for Mountain Emergency Medicine. And as I said, he has proposed this score. And as you see, this is just a paper which has come out recently. And I think this could be sort of a game changer, really a game changer in the field of hypothermic cardiac arrest. Hypothermic cardiac arrest is quite different compared to other cardiac arrests, because until now, potassium was considered as an outcome predictor compared to normothermic cardiac arrest. So with a potassium, as you will see, higher or lower, one was either going towards rewarming or considered as being very likely to have died before needing any rewarming with a potassium, let's say, above 12 in avalanche, in accidental hypothermia above 12 or 8 in hypothermia in avalanches. And as you know, the general quotation in accidental hypothermia is no one is warm until, or nobody is dead until warm and dead. And you certainly know this poor chap who has died more than 5,300 years ago, and who is actually now also deposited very close to Hermann Brucker's UX Center, just a few hundred meters away in the beautiful Südtirol, South Tyrol. But we are not talking about these patients, where probably rescue is a little bit coming too late. We're more talking about other patients. And if, let's say, who have chances of survival. And if you look at this data, you will clearly see that, for instance, people who are, so they are all cold, but as you see, some are just exposed to cold, but others are also hypoxic. And as you see, there's a chance in survival in those people who are just cold. They survive to up to 70% if they had cardiac arrest. Only due to hypothermia, but if hypothermia is connected to hypoxia, the chances of survival are low. And if you compare even, which is even more important, people who are neurologically intact, the chances of survival are even lower, being neurologically intact if hypoxia is one of the cofactors. So certainly the way towards cardiac arrest differs also makes a difference for the outcome. So generally, patients who arrest because of hypothermia have an excellent outcome, but if there is hypoxia connected to this cardiac arrest, the chances are certainly lower. And so this is the issue I brought up before. So this is basically the potassium triage, which one does, and which is internationally done if a patient arrests in cardiac arrest and is hypothermic and is considered for rewarming. The general attitude now would be extracorporeal rewarming, either with cardiopulmonary bypass or ECMO. And for patients who are just accidentally hypothermic, the cutoff at the moment is 12, because there have been survivors up to a potassium of 11.7. That's where this comes from. And for avalanche victims, the cutoff is 8, just for avalanche victims, because the highest survivor with, let's say, the survivor with the highest potassium so far has been at 6.7. So this is where these cutoffs come from, and this is what is used. But we know if you just use these cutoffs, we rewarm far too many patients who will just die within a few days because of hypoxic cerebral edema. So there is certainly an issue by some centers and, let's say, generally in the field to improve this outcome prediction. And so basically we're coming, that's where the HOPE score comes from. Just to give you an idea where the hyperkalemia came from, many years ago already, almost 30 years ago, Schaller from Lausanne, they conducted the first study in hypothermic cardiac, in hypothermic patients with and without cardiac arrest. And what they found out was that for patients who just were hypothermic and simply arrested without hypoxia, so no oxygen deprivation, the potassium was very low. And as you see here, there are 2 patients who were in cardiac arrest, just hypothermic in cardiac arrest, no hypoxia, and both survived without any sequelae. So they did well. But when they took in the same hospital, when they took a sample of hypothermic patients, so also hypothermic patients who were all in cardiac arrest, cardiorespiratory arrest, and they were all rewarmed with cardiopulmonary bypass here, they all died. They all were dead, and that was mainly because the potassium was so high. And so the authors, Schaller and colleagues in Lausanne, concluded that there's probably several factors who independently predict outcome in these hypothermic patients, but certainly potassium is one cofactor, and they suggested that maybe a cutoff of 10 millimole per liter at that time would just be predictive. So in 1990, Schaller suggested the 10 millimole per liter, which then was further developed. Then there was this survivor at 11.7. Then there were some others with 11.4 millimole per liter of potassium surviving also. And this is where then the 12 millimole cutoff came from. And right now we say, okay, there are survivors with accidental hypothermia up to 11.7, but this is just for accidental hypothermia where there is no hypoxia. But in avalanches, the situation is different, because if people are buried, very commonly, people tend to suffocate quickly. So there are very few people who will cool down substantially in an avalanche until they arrest just from temperature. From the few cases we know so far is that the temperature needed to cool down to a degree where you could go in cardiac arrest is around an hour. So the fastest cooling is around 8 to 9 centigrades per hour. So one needs to be an hour in the snow, still breathing, and only then go into cardiac arrest to have this protective effect from hypothermia. But this happens very rarely. So that's why there are just a few survivors with avalanches. And that's why the cutoff for potassium in the avalanche is lower, actually. So we also found some high potassium levels for avalanche victims. As I said, 6.7, 7.9. Then there came one up also with even higher potassium levels in deep hypothermia. So as I want to show is that this is still something which is developing. Nobody knows for sure. And we just say, consider stopping CPR, consider continuing CPR. And there are different algorithms which have been developed in the meantime on avalanche rescue algorithms, but also algorithms on accidental hypothermia. And the new thing now in 2018 is this HOPE score, which I will introduce. So we know from other studies outside of hypothermic cardiac arrest that age and sex can be predictive. For instance, in this study, age and being man or being a male was slightly more dangerous than being female and younger. So it seems that in some studies, age and gender influences survival. Then I showed you already this study where the mechanism of cardiac arrest being connected with hypoxia or normoxia makes a difference, obviously for the brain and for the heart. And there are also some indications that the temperature makes a difference. So for instance, there are a few studies showing that a very high temperature, of course, if you go into arrest with normothermia, is not good for your brain, of course, because then you have just a few minutes of tolerance for being in cardiac arrest. That's not good. But on the other side, being at very low temperature is not good neither, because probably these patient has already been so long under the snow exposed to cold that he's probably just dead, and just dead since hours. Yeah? So probably the safe margin for temperature is somewhere in the middle. It's like a U-shape. So temperature may have an influence. And then, of course, witness cardiac arrest, as you know also from urban cardiac arrest, it's safer. It's considered to be safer because if somebody witnesses the cardiac arrest, he will start CPR immediately. And then, of course, at least in normothermic cardiac arrest, that makes a difference. As you can say here, for instance, so witnessed bystander. So this is another big review on, let's say, on factors of cardiac arrest. And for instance, in cohorts, or let's say in places where there was a low survival, very poor rescue system, very low rate of bystander CPR, witnessed cardiac arrest by bystanders at a survival rate of 6.4% only, and in other regions it was 13.5%. But if it was witnessed, or let's say it was just 6.4, but if it was witnessed, but it was non-witnessed, so just somebody was collapsing and not undergoing resuscitation by anybody, the survival was much lower. So as you see, bystander CPR definitely makes a difference. And of course, if you are witnessed by EMS, that's even better. So it seems that being witnessed in cardiac arrest is also prognostically probably better, and the same is true for the cardiac arrhythmia, where one is found in. For instance, if he is found into VF, the chances are certainly better than if somebody is in a systole or in pulseless electrical activity. So the cardiac rhythm probably makes also difference. So also this was considered as to be probably predictive for these hypothermic patients. And then, of course, the duration of CPR seems also to make a difference, because if one looks at a survival to hospital discharge with less than 30 minutes of CPR, the outcome is, let's say, quite good. 20% of patients being discharged with a CPR less than 20 minutes, and then it goes down slowly, because this low blood flow one does with chest compression is just around 30–40% of normal blood flow. So that means patients are suffering, the brain and the heart and the rest of the body is suffering just by chest compressions, and certainly the duration of CPR impacts negatively on outcomes. So it was concluded that also the duration of CPR is a predictive marker. And just to give you an idea, as you see here, the longer, let's say, a survival in normothermic cardiac arrest above 60 minutes of manual chest compressions is close to 0. But in hypothermic cardiac arrest, a chap from Norway in a very remote area was resuscitated for 6.5 hours in a small remote place where there was no possibility to do ECMO or CPB rewarming. So they just rewarmed him in this small hospital, and he had a normal outcome, yeah, with 6.5 hours of CPR. And this is only possible if people are severely hypothermic. So this chap was around 28 centigrades. And this, of course, reduced the amount of oxygen in his brain, and this prolonged the time one could be resuscitated with this low blood flow during CPR. And then, of course, there was also this issue if the rewarming method makes a difference. So is there a difference between cardiopulmonary bypass and ECMO? Because as some of you might be aware, many people who are rewarmed from hypothermic cardiac arrest, they tend to develop ARDS, so acute respiratory distress syndrome, so severe pulmonary complications, gas exchange problems. And if a patient is on ECMO, he can one can bridge this phase, while with CPB, reports suggest that patients tend to die more frequently because this ARDS cannot be bridged. Okay, so how to proceed? We knew that there were quite a lot of factors who potentially could influence outcome, but all these factors until now in hypothermic cardiac arrest could not be found to have any outcome, let's say, prediction. Why? Probably because, as Herman said before, the numbers of patients included in every study were so small that only potassium was shining out. And so we had to find a way to test also for these factors. So this is where the hypothermia outcome prediction score after ECLS rewarming comes in place. And basically, what we did in this study was basically to collect a lot of patients, so a lot of case series of patients in hypothermic cardiac arrest treated with ECLS rewarming. So we contacted different centers who had treated these patients and who had published a case series, and we asked them if they could provide the data of, let's say, which I showed you for every patient. And we wanted to have a continuous case series, so not to have only the positive cases, but to include also those who did not survive. So we wanted to see all of them, the complete success story. And finally, after scanning all these publications, we ended up with 18 studies where we contacted centers, and they provided us these cases, this data, and they also, in part, included additional patients which they had treated in the meantime since publication of the data. So, of course, for the HOPE score, we included potassium, which is the strongest indicator for sure, as we know now since almost 30 years, but we also included all these other factors. And this is now sort of a Pandora's box for me as a medical doctor. This now comes to logistical regression and reducing basically the strength of every of these factors down to the bottom, and to see which one of these predictors really makes a difference in outcome prediction. And so basically this is where all these patients came from. So 260 from Europe, and a few from Asia, and a few from America. But just to give you an idea of all patients rewarmed so far in the literature, of all the continuous series, this is approximately 2/3. So again, as Hermann said, these are very small numbers. Yeah, we're not talking about case reports, but just continuous case series. So 2/3 of all patients published so far. The chunk of most patients came from Europe, from different centers. Some authors which were contacted, they did not reply. But anyway, at the very end, when we looked at the data we were able to collect, there was a survival, there were 37% of survivors to hospital discharge, and most of them had a good outcome. And one should be aware that if they arrest these patients, it's often that they die because they have an underlying disease. So it's a sort of secondary hypothermia, as the Japanese report quite often. So sick old patients who may be cachectic, so they die of the second, let's say they die of their primary disease, so it's secondary hypothermia. That's why they go into cardiac arrest, because of an internal disease quite often. But if it's primary hypothermia, the survival rate can be even higher. So this is quite good, 84% survivors with good neurological outcome. Okay, so if we look now into the univariate analysis of the factors I explained before, so we see that we could see that age makes a difference. So survivors tended to be a bit older in this case series. So age was predictive, but higher age was better than being at a lower age, for whatever reason in this series. And then there was also a difference in gender. So the males, as we have seen in the other study before, they tend to fare worse for whatever reason. Females seem to have whatever. We cannot say. We can just say males survive less than females in this case series. Then it's up to you to decide why. And secondly, we looked also at the mechanism. Was the cardiac arrest related with hypoxia or not? And as you see here, of course, if hypothermic cardiac arrest is not related with hypoxia, the chances of survival are better. And again here, the potassium, this is already very much known, is that survivors tend to have a normal, let's say a normal potassium, or let's say certainly lower than 8. But 8 is already very excessive, or lower than 12. And the temperature made a difference, but a very slight difference only in absolute terms. So, and then there was also a difference, of course, with the cardiac arrhythmia. And of course, as you see here, survivors tended to have a bit more of ventricular fibrillation, and asystole was certainly detrimental, certainly something which one should not have. And of course, a lower CPR duration was also beneficial, at least in this scenario. And also, survivors tended to have witness cardiac arrest. So quite as we thought. And the data for cardiopulmonary bypass or ECMO rewarming was quite inconclusive, so there was no difference. All right, so and coming down now from this univariate analysis to multivariate analysis and with very skewed data. So we would have liked to have this data, but it was super skewed. We basically needed, as Herman said before, we needed statistical support, of course. And this gentleman from Lausanne provided the statistical support. He was the senior author of this study. And he boiled down all these parameters and came out with a formula, which is outside of my field. So basically, we run the loops, let's say, of survival with all this univariate analysis, as I showed, and try to get to a multivariate analysis, combining all these factors, and just have to sort of have a number which says percentage of survival 80% or 5% or whatever. So that's what we did basically. And so in this multivariable analysis, age was a factor which stood out. Gender was a factor. Mechanism of cardiac arrest. Remember, normoxia, hypoxia. Potassium, of course, and then, of course, temperature also. But interestingly, witness cardiac arrest was not found to be a factor in this multivariate analysis, and neither also the first written detected in this cardiac arrest patient. The duration of CPR was also a factor, and as we have seen before in the univariate analysis, the rewarming method was also not predictive. So finally, we came out with this HOPE score, and basically, as you see here, you may now insert all these 6 factors into this online available score, like the age, the gender, then the way where the mechanism where this patient arrested with or without hypoxia, the duration of CPR, the potassium, and also the temperature. If you start, then you get a chance of survival according to this HOPE score. And as I said, it may give 5, 10, 80, 90%. And probably this is a little bit more reliable as a simple potassium. So basically, what we found out was that the people, as you see here, people who were really dead, according to this retrospective data, they tended all to have a HOPE score below 30, while the survivors were considered to be much lower. But as you see, there's also some overlap with some outliers between the survivors and non-survivors. But as you see here, in this regression analysis and in the survival curve, the potassium just has an area under the curve of just 77%. That means the potassium can just predict survival with a chance of 75, 77%, while the HOPE score has a higher predictive score ranging around 90%. So at least this study suggests that it may be of value. If we now compare, let's say, the HOPE score to the potassium triage, which is at the moment done in this hypothermic cardiac arrest patients, then we can say with potassium above 12, we would exclude from this cohort of 191, or let's say if we take 100 patients, let's say if we break it down to 100 patients, with a 12, above 12, there would be just 5. They would be, of course, excluded. But with a HOPE score below 10% of survival, we would already exclude 32 patients. So they would not be rewarmed at all. They would just be considered as too low for survival. So this is just a proposal. But with a potassium below 12, at the moment, and that's the problem which I highlighted to you before, at the moment we would still rewarm 95%, where we would then find out that 58 of this, or let's say we would rewarm 95 patients out of 100, where we would then find out that 58 would die within a few days. And that's the problem where let's say there's limited acceptance of potassium triage by some hospitals stems from. So 58 would die within a few days, and only 37 would survive to some extent, neurologically intact or not intact. That's not being shown in this HOPE score. But if you go to the HOPE score, as we said, 32% would be excluded anyway, just from the beginning, and only 68 instead of 95 would be rewarmed. So these patients here would die, and only those patients, so which is a little bit more than 50% of those rewarmed, would survive. So as I said at the beginning, it seems to give a bit better discrimination between survivors and non-survivors. So the take-home messages from this Hope lecture is that basically I could show you that for the first time a multivariate analysis was performed on hypothermic cardiac arrest patients. We could find in this first study of this sort that there were 6 independent survival parameters which were then combined in this score. This seems to be a paradigm shift away from a dichotomous scoring of lower or higher than 12 in accidental hypothermic patients, or lower and higher 8 in avalanche victims, down to a more complex scoring system, which can be cleared with this formula, as I showed. And this could help with rewarming people on extracorporeal life support if they are in hypothermic cardiac arrest. And probably, or hopefully, this score could also help, this version 1.0 could also help to discriminate better between those who need rewarming and who deserve the rewarming with these limited resources, and of those who have a very poor outcome. And if you have to triage because there are few at the same arriving at the same time, you can then also maybe better predict who to rewarm and who not. Right. And that's, again, where you can basically retrieve the score, where you can access the score. Everywhere where there's internet, you can just access this score and just try and just fiddle around also and try to insert values. And hopefully this will be helpful also in the future to treat our patients. And well, that's basically already the end. And if you have any questions, I'm very happy to respond. Thank you very much.